3 years ago, pre-pandemic, I was a full-time university instructor. When I spoke about autism and education to groups, I was telling families and students that we need to shape individualized education programs and 504 plans with transitions in mind. At each university where I taught, I met neurodiverse students struggling because the supports they had come to rely on were no longer provided after high school. We need to prepare students for what comes after the K-12 years. Welcome to the Autistic Me podcast. I am Christopher Scott Wyatt. In this episode, I'll be discussing IEPs and 504 plans with Dr. Jerry Turner, founder of IEP Incorporated. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to mention my family's current situation. Our local school district just announced at least 17 elementary classrooms are on 10-day COVID-19 quarantine. Staffing shortages continue, especially within special education and student support services. Welcome to the start of the 2021-22 school year. Special education for some students simply isn't feasible with the virtual learning model. As the parent of two neurodiverse children, I want them to have every support possible. Legally, disabled students are entitled to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment possible. Unfortunately, neither of my daughters has received school-based services since March 2020, and I doubt they will anytime soon. Taking our current reality into account, and with a hopeful look towards the future, I want to welcome Dr. Jerry Turner to the podcast. Dr. Turner is a licensed educational psychologist in California and the founder of IEP Incorporated. Dr. Turner has almost 2 decades of experience in school psychology and independent consulting. Dr. Turner's books include A Special Education Guide for Teachers and Administrators, published in 2020, My Child Learns Differently, The Parent's Guide to Special Education, published in 2018, and So You Are a School Psychologist, a guide for interns and first-year psychologists. The last book is in its 3rd edition and was first published in 2012. For more than a decade, Dr. Turner has mentored aspiring school psychologists through California's state-mandated 1,200 hours of in-service training for interns. Dr. Turner is also a former member of the board of directors of the California Association of School Psychologists. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Turner.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Let's begin with an overview of what it is that you do as IEP Incorporated and as a psychologist. What are your special services?
So right now we take a team approach to providing individualized educational evaluations throughout the nation. Once a school district has evaluated a student, the parent has a right to a second opinion. And that second opinion is provided, of course, at district expense. And we step in, and instead of just a lot of your independent assessors, it's one single psychologist going out doing the testing, coming back, writing the report. We determined when we founded this company that a team approach would be much better. So we'll have a couple of psychologists, maybe a speech and language pathologist, an OT if necessary. We have former teachers and principals on staff. A couple of us might go out and work directly with the student, and then we get together in groups of maybe 3 or 4, sometimes 5, and just discuss the results from all these different points of view. So, and then the report is generated from a multi-point of view aspect.
You mentioned that parents can then ask for this in addition to what is generally a very superficial screening that is performed by most of our schools.
Absolutely, yes. IDEA allows for a second opinion, an independent evaluation anytime the district assesses a kid for special education, whether it's an initial assessment or triennial, or out here in California, we do assessments for transportation, assessments for mental health services. Any of those assessments, the parent can request an independent second opinion.
How many parents are aware that they can obtain that second opinion or at least raise questions even about that initial evaluation done by the school?
Unfortunately, very few. The information is usually provided to the parents at the IEP meeting in what's called procedural safeguards or parent rights. But let's face it, it's a lot of legalese and a lot of parents don't take the time to read it. But it's probably their most important tool is this independent assessment, only because the school psychologists, I was a school psychologist for 16 years. And I tell you, we had a caseload. I would write probably 70, 80 reports a year. So I didn't have a lot of time to spend on any one student. Now, as an independent assessor, I might do 12 to 20 reports a year. And I might spend a month or two on a single assessment with my team. And we take a look at it and we really drill down till we find out what's going on, what the child needs. Also, as an independent, I'm not tied to what the district is offering or what they usually offer. I'm tied to what the student needs.
Do you believe that the schools are resistant to encouraging that second evaluation because this possibly leads to additional services?
In my experience, they haven't been reluctant to approve an independent assessment, mainly because the law requires that you either approve the request for a second assessment, an independent assessment, or you take the parent to due process and prove that your assessment was sufficient. It varies state to state, but in California, to get a due process even started is going to cost the district around $20,000. Independent assessments come in around $5,000. So they truly would prefer to do an independent assessment than to fight it. That being said, recently there was a district out here in California that for years and years was turning down parent requests, all parent requests. And I've worked with some advocates who have been frustrated and CDE complaints were filed. Nothing changed. Last year, a parent took the school to due process over this. The district tried to defend their position of not providing an independent assessment, and the judge ruled against them. And that district has now, I'm getting independent referrals left and right, as it should have been, because the courts will back the parent most of the time on independent evaluation. The courts do not expect the parent to be the expert and explain why they disagree. The courts expect the parent to know their child better than anybody, and even better than a trained school psychologist who comes in and spends a few hours with the child, administering some standardized tests. And if the parent feels that the school psychologist got it wrong, they deserve a second opinion.
This holistic evaluation that you perform, you mentioned there's an entire team involved. As we're in the schools, we're typically dealing with one or two evaluators. So you have a much more in-depth and thorough analysis of the child?
Yeah, it works out that way. It's going to be more in depth because you've got teachers looking at the report, looking at the numbers. And see, this is one of my pet peeves with the IEP process. The law requires that the school administrator makes the offer of FAPE. They make the offer of what services, accommodations, modifications will be provided. But in practice, who does that? The special education teacher. The special education teacher has a conflict of interest because they're the ones that's going to have to provide the service. And they're not going to get paid more money for providing more services. I've met some remarkable special education teachers, and I'm not saying this is true for all of them, but there's this underlying cognitive dissonance between offering a lot more services and making more work for myself and just going on and doing what I've been doing and fit this kid into a service I'm already providing. As a special ed teacher, that conflict goes on. You don't really see it bluntly because our special education teachers are usually trying their very best. A few years ago, I did see it very bluntly when I was a director of special education and the school psychologist for a charter school district. This one teacher, she had a policy. You either fit into one of my groups if you're an initial kid coming in, or if you needed something really independent and you fought for it and got it, she would assign the special ed aide to do that work. And that just wasn't right.
As a parent, I have two concerns, and they're conflicting. And I think every parent goes through this. I do want my children to have every possible support. And yet, as a university professor, when I encounter students who have had too much support or not the proper support, they struggle in the university or the college setting that lacks the supports that they had become accustomed to. The law at the university level says that I can control the nature and outcomes of a course. So I had a student who wanted to be a vet scientist, right? She wanted to study equine veterinary medicine, but she would have meltdowns during the simulations. We had to sit down and explain to this student, in reality, when you are out there doing a job, an injured horse cannot wait for the equine vet to get over a meltdown. The horse is injured, the horse needs help. So the simulation could not be adapted with extra time or isolation or special earmuffs or any. We could not do that because that would change the nature of the career path that person was getting a degree in. And the federal courts have upheld that for nursing and other degrees as well. A deaf nurse challenged a test, but the point of the test was that in hospitals, some of the equipment have sound and light alarms that go off, and the nurse has to respond to those alarms to fix the life-saving settings of a life support machine. How do we balance that parental desire that my child gets every possible advantage during the K-12 experience without sabotaging what's going to happen to that student in college, the university, and beyond?
You used two terms when you started there, enough and proper services. I think the key to ensuring they get both without getting too much is to put the individualization back in individualized education plan. One of the things that we do as independent assessors is we only have your child to look at, their needs, their performance, their requirements to be successful in school. And so that's all we're worried about. We're not worried about what groups the special education teacher is already teaching, what groups the counselor already has available. That doesn't weigh in. If you can individualize the accommodations and the services and the modifications, then you meet the student's needs. And as every person in special education will tell you, we're always striving for the least restrictive environment, just to avoid what you said, not to provide the student with a crutch, not to become a crutch. That least restricted, though, like everything else in special education, has to be individualized. A student with a lot of potential in one area, their LRE should be, to get A's or to go on to an AP class, whereas in another area, it might not be so. As we go into college, and the example you gave with the equine therapy, I really feel if that student had the individualized services and they were not over-serviced, this would not be a field they would actually come to cognitively realize they want to go into because they're not fit for it. They would not be happy in that field. They would not be successful. And so sometimes we're providing so many services because we're not individualizing them, we're setting these kids up for failure.
We have been telling students they can be anything they want to be for a long time, and I have to be realistic. I could not be anything I want to be. I love many things I cannot do.
Right. Whether it's related to your ability to not do it or the opportunity isn't presented. So the idea that we can be anything we want to be is a pie in the sky fantasy.
When we're dealing with the neurodiverse, especially the autistic student who's twice exceptional, maybe has a splinter skill, a savant skill, just gifted, it's very hard for them to make transitions as it is. And now we're telling them, okay, you're going into high school and then college, and we're going to take away these supports. That's a very difficult thing for someone who's dependent on those. You have 12 years of supports, taking them away suddenly instead of phasing them out. It's not entirely on the student and the parent that student then fails at the college or university. In some ways, it's the K-12 system that failed to prepare them for the non-academic aspects of success.
Right.
And IEPs and 504s should include, and the best ones do include, some non-academic goals.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, after 15, they include transition goals for post-high school. Let's talk about a couple of things. You know, the Army logo, be all you can be, right? And I like that. I like that. But when it comes to education, what we're trying to teach all of our students, including those on the spectrum, is to learn how to be who you are. And once you can be who you are, you'll find your career, your success, your happiness, your life path. In schools, going all the way back to what we said earlier, the goals, the baselines, everything has to be individualized. And the power of individualizing is that you can create a fading plan. If you sit down with an accommodation that says, hey, Johnny needs extra time on task, well, that's not individualized. Every teacher interprets that differently. Every parent interprets that differently. And when it comes down to grading, you've got a parent view, a principal view, a teacher view, and they're all going to disagree. But if Johnny has until the Monday after the due date for general education kids to turn in his work, now you've got you've got a limit. You've got a very individualized, because now Johnny's going to lose his weekend making up that work he didn't do during the week. Now, if it's an older student, that starts to motivate them. I want to get my work done so I have my weekend. For younger students, let's individualize it. Let's make it measurable. Let's say we give the student 2 extra days, and the SAI teacher tracks on those timelines, or a special education teacher. The coordinator out here would be what we call an SAI teacher, specialized academic instructor. Used to be called a special ed, used to be called RSP. So I just don't want to confuse some of the national listeners. So if you took an individualized accommodation like extra time, and you said, okay, 2 extra days, and you tracked on that, and Johnny kept meeting that deadline, now we can fade it back to 1 extra day. And then we can eventually get rid of it as we teach Johnny to keep up with the work. And as keeping up with the work becomes self-fulfilling, it becomes its own reinforcement. Hey, I'm doing this. I'm keeping up with it. Then when I go to college, the only accommodations and services that I have are the ones that I absolutely need. And most colleges can accommodate those in most classes. In California, I know that I taught at the community college and the bachelor's and master's level for a few years, and we always had students coming in with accommodations. But they were quite reasonable accommodations. It wasn't a whole lot of accommodations. You could tell it was exactly what the student needed to have a chance to succeed in your class.
When we talk about individualizing the program, I think you're right. Some of the schools, some of the teachers taking the simple approach of, this is how I treat all of the special needs students. My oldest was moved to what they called the wiggle table because she fidgets. That's one of the observable traits, is she rocks and fidgets. The problem with that approach is putting a bunch of kids who are in motion all together, you end up with synchronized rapid motion. And instead of an individualized approach, though, it was much easier to just lump students together. She had a table for them. She had another table for this other group, or whatever it is. And the individualization being lost is in part because of the sheer volume of work that these people are doing. But the downside of that is in some ways, as with the wiggle table, the teacher and the campus might be creating more work for themselves unintentionally. How do we get the schools to understand that individualizing the IEP, truly individualizing it, and truly focusing the 504 has the benefit of ideally less work for the teacher and eventually less supports being offered? So how do we pitch that to the school that if you individualize this effectively, it will actually mean less work and less supports are necessary later on?
Even with my training early on as a school psychologist, I had no idea of the power of fading a support until I met up with a BCBA, Board Certified Behavior Analyst. We got talking, and the one thing I took away from our conversation was I want this person's knowledge. I went to the University of Massachusetts Laurel, and I've got a graduate certificate as a BCBA. Now, I never did the 1,200 hours of interns that license required, but I got the knowledge. And it's that level of knowledge that we need to get into our school psychologists and into our teachers, this understanding, this importance of understanding, first of all, when you're talking baseline and accommodations, most teachers, you walk into an IEP class with a diagnosis of other health impaired due to ADHD, and what accommodations are you going to get? Extra time on task, or no, increased breaks, more frequent breaks. You're going to get extra time to complete work. You're going to get frequent check-ins. All these just common interventions with absolutely no guidelines or limits. A good BCBA will tell you, let's keep the child a little bit frustrated, because that's where we learn. We don't learn if we're doing math we already know. We learn if we're doing math that's a little bit frustrating to us and we're really challenging ourselves to figure it out. It requires a lot of individualized tracking and data tracking. I think if we could get teachers to do a better job of tracking data to see when your daughter, or just exactly how much time did your daughter need at that wiggle table? Did she need a full day, a couple of hours, 5 minutes every hour? What is it that she needed? Where is that individualization? It all has to come down to training, and it all has to come down to teachers willing to take on, and I agree with you, they are overworked, but we're willing to take on more data tracking and see the long-term benefits, how this will fade out, services will fade. And what will happen is you'll have services at the bottom level, at the necessary level for the kids. And when a new student comes into special ed on their caseload, they're like, hey, I've got time. I'm going to, we're going to give this kid everything they need. And then we're going to start an intensive fading program and get them down here with providing as little services as possible.
You already had a PhD in psychology before entering the school settings.
Correct.
Most states, it is someone with a master's degree who is juggling 30 or 40 cases at a school site, who doesn't have the PhD, doesn't have the same level of rigorous continuing education required for private practice licensure of a PhD. How do we, as parents, as educators, how do we work with that person and have reasonable expectations and reasonable understandings that this is an individual who is a school psychologist who is balancing, as I said, too much work with too little current training, doing the best they can in a difficult situation? So how do we balance our expectations against reality? Because here I am as the parent wanting everything, but as a teacher, I know I can't do everything in my class. So how do we balance those parent expectations versus reality?
That's a great question. There's going to be no easy answer, because every parent out there wants to be able, just naturally, we want to trust our educators. And most parents walk into those meetings believing that the school psychologist is an expert in all things related to psychology. Your special ed teacher is an expert in everything related to disabilities. Your principal is an expert and knows everything going on the campus. And that's just not the case. So parents need to educate themselves, like the parents listening to podcasts like yours. And then they're going to probably, I hate to say it, but there's not enough money in special education. Not that money's going to fix the problem, but I can tell you right now, the parents I have seen who've gotten the services their student needed were the parents who could make the most noise. Whether that was constantly sending emails and questioning the team, or whether that's hiring an advocate or an attorney, or at least requesting an individualized assessment every single time the school does an assessment. these parents get what their student needs because they're bringing in multiple, they're educating themselves. They're reading their parent safeguards. They understand the IDEA, the law governing special education. Best of intentions is good. And the school psychologist and your special ed team, your entire team has the best of intentions. The problem is their tool bag is limited. And if all I have is a hammer, every problem's going to be a nail.
How does having private evaluations help with that situation then?
So most of your people in private practice, like myself, we have to get CEUs. You mentioned continuing education units. I think that is key. I have to get 40 every other year, which is not, doesn't sound like a lot, but it's much more than, in California, school psychologists have to get no continuing education units to renew their credential. And a licensed educational psychologist, like I said, we get 40. That's about typical. So that keeps me on my toes. The fact that I can spend so much time with a student, I had a student recently, probably my first actual dyscalculia case ever. And I learned that the way we define dyscalculia in America is almost universally wrong. There's a lot of research, and when I started researching for this case, I came across a professor doing a lot of studies at the University of Oxford, England. His explanation of dyscalculia fit this student so perfectly. I realized I was looking at a very true case of dyscalculia, and not just a student who was struggling in math, but a student who did not have number sense. For a kid with dyscalculia, if I showed you three objects and you would see three objects. For a kid with dyscalculia, they would see 1, 2, 3 objects. The threeness wouldn't be natural to them. And this concept of numberness is important, but this is something that I was never taught as a school psychologist. It's never come up in a continuing education course that I've had. It only comes about through experience and having the time to really dig down and find out what's going on with a student. If I don't walk away from an independent case learning something, I've probably not done that kid justice. And so my goal is I'm going to learn something from every kid, every case, that I have time to learn that the school psychologist just doesn't have time.
You emphasize the fading of supports in your work. That's important to me as an individual. I do want as little support as necessary to do my job, to do my daily functions. For me, physically, I'm thinking when I was teaching in Pennsylvania, I had a lot of trouble walking for a while, and the dean made sure every ramp was fixed. Every concrete ramp worked, and it was a minor thing. Making sure those ramps worked, I could wheel my stuff up in my wheeled case, my wheeled computer case. That is a reasonable accommodation. What I'm not asking for major renovations to life at the university. I was just making sure the ramps were in maintained condition. And I think most parents want their child to reach that point where all we really need are those minimal natural supports that don't really create an unreasonable burden, an unreasonable expense on employers and government agencies, on the world around us. I know as someone with sensory processing issues, I cannot get on a train and expect the wheels to be silent. I can't. So I have to know that I need to take my responsibility is to take my headphones, to take my coping strategies. But as someone who has mobility issues, I certainly have every right to expect that the train station has a ramp.
Right. If in elementary school, middle school, high school, every time you got on the bus or train, you had a one-on-one aide with you who carried your headset, who reminded you of your self-calming, you would have never learned that. A good fading program would eventually allowed you to have gotten on a bus by yourself without a one-on-one aide, maybe a reminder before you got on the bus, and then not even that. Now, I'm not saying that ever happened to you, but what happens is that parents get this one-on-one aid, and then they're so afraid to let it go because the aide hasn't learned to fade services and work herself or himself out of a job. And so again, you have this conflict of interest going on here where I must start providing so little services and help this person be so independent that I'm not needed anymore?
It's difficult as a parent. My wife and I had this discussion a day or two ago about our little one, the 8-year-old. We wonder how much she can do on her own. If you leave her with an assignment, she will sit there and do nothing, apparently. And unfortunately, because she had wraparound services and had a dedicated one-on-one for part of her schooling, she has reached a point now during COVID where she's at home. She expects one of us to sit down across from her and engage on every question, on every sheet. So if she's doing a 10 problem math sheet, she wants us to be there for every step of every problem. And my wife is concerned that that's not how third grade or fourth grade will be. She can't keep expecting someone to do every digit with her of every problem.
And then middle school is even going to be worse. I mean, middle school teachers, they see a lot of students, many more students a day, and you're not with the same teacher all day long. Let's take your 8-year-old, and let's say, for example, she's doing no work right now on her own.
That would be accurate.
Okay, so a good program would involve incentivizing her to do one problem, right? Finding something she will work for. And then you might reinforce that with a positive reinforcement, one problem an hour or one problem a day, whatever she's capable of. And once it gets to where she can do it routinely for that reward, you take it up. Okay, you're getting better, you're getting older. Now we're going to have to do 2 problems for the same reward. And then 3 problems. And pretty soon completing the work becomes the natural reinforcement. And they're not working for the reward anymore, but they're working for the self-gratification of having completed the work. But there's a few caveats to that. You have to monitor the growth. So if she starts where she can do 3 problems, I don't know what you're giving her. Maybe it's a Tootsie Roll, okay? And she loves Tootsie Rolls, and she's doing 3 problems for a Tootsie Roll. You take it up to 4. She gets really frustrated, isn't successful, can't do it. You take it back down to 3, and then you work on taking it back up to 4. And so a good fading program bounces back and forth, much like the stock market, as it's been doing lately. And eventually you either reach her performance ceiling currently, which that will change as she gets older, so you keep testing the limits, or she's no longer interested in the Tootsie Roll because she's getting her work done, and that's just feeling good to her. So when you use the term natural supports, you're also looking for this natural, to create this natural reinforcement within her. It's not an easy process. If you don't understand the small steps necessary to get there, you just keep meeting at IEP meetings and saying she currently can do 3. A year from now, she'll be able to do 10. Well, next year, she's currently doing 3. A year from now, she'll be able to do 10. There's no real change because there's no small intermediate steps that are being really examined.
I'm going to ask a question. It's a little bit of a tangent, but it's based on your comment about BCBA knowledge and supports. A lot of the autism self-advocates, myself included, have seen some very horrible examples of ABA with aversions, with taking away of items.
Mm-hmm.
And my response to some of the autistics has been, I definitely agree that the ABA I experienced in the 70s and 80s, the therapies and supports of the past were bad. Some of them now are bad. Yet as a parent, I am engaging in some basic behavioral modification techniques. You finish your homework, even if we have to do it with you, you can go outside and play on the slip and slide. You can go outside and ride your bike, but you have to show me you're going to do some of this work. How do we explain in non-threatening terms? It is not ABA. I am not using behavior analysis in a clinical way, but as in a way that every parent and teacher has always done. There is an incentive, but eventually I hope that you are intrinsically motivated. Eventually, I hope the motivation comes from within. But for right now, I know my 8-year-old, the thing that makes her happy is knowing that if she does her work on the weekend, she's going to get pool time or slip and slide or water guns. Or yes, there's right now an extrinsic motivation, and I know that that's very basic. But I do run into the occasional criticism, well, you're using behavioral techniques on your child. And I'm like, well, hate to say it, but I think every parent does to some extent. There really is no, until she develops that internal motivation, I am left with saying, if you want to play, you need to finish your work.
Excellent point. And in fact, a few years ago, I was reading an interesting paper on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And the study made the initial claim. Well, when I say initial, I mean, I haven't followed up on where they went with this, but they made the claim that there really is no such thing as an intrinsic motivation. All motivation is extrinsic. Whether we're working to do a great job because other people are feeling good about themselves and we're helping the community or we're getting a paycheck, what we have typically thought of as internal motivation actually turns out to be a lot more external than we realize. Number one, you mentioned this poor habit of punishment or taking away. So in the work of Skinner, he described your punishment versus reinforcement, positive, negative punishment, positive, negative reinforcement. The problem with punishment is that it doesn't teach the child an alternative behavior. Punishment has to have teaching with it in order for, when I was teaching college, I always talked about Johnny, who, he's in 6th grade. He's decided that he likes girls. And so he's falling in love. He thinks with Julie and he wants to talk to Julie. So what does he do? Well, like with all of his guy friends, he goes up to Julie at PE and punches her in the arm. Bam! And Julie screams. Well, he meant to get her attention, to be a friend, to like he would with his guy friends. So he gets sent to the office and the principal says, Johnny, we don't punch girls. Go home. You're suspended. So Johnny goes home and he's watching TV and he's thinking he still likes Julie, but we don't punch girls. Okay. So he goes back to school and they're running track during PE. And he's like, if this was one of my guy friends, I would just trip him. And he would fall and we'd laugh about it and have a good time. So he trips Julie. And Julie falls and she screams. And Johnny goes to the office. Principal says, we don't trip kids. You go home. You're suspended for 2 days. He's getting frustrated this time, And he comes back to school and he's going to do something even worse. Julie's going to raise her hand to ask a question of the teacher and get it wrong. And Johnny's going to stand up and say, you don't know nothing, because he's going to tease her like he would his guy friends. And imagine that scenario, but go the whole way back to where Johnny punches Julie in the arm. And the principal says, we don't punch kids in the arm. Next, but I understand you want to get Julie's attention. Here's what you're going to do. Next, when you come back, get into the lunch line behind her. And when she goes to pay for her lunch, say, no, I got this. Teach him an alternative skill. Punishment with teaching is the only way you would want to use punishment. The only way you'd want to take away something. I worked with a great principal who one time said, you can't say something bad about a kid until you've given them 5 positives. That was his rule in the classroom. And if you didn't give them 5 positives, you had to find something to say good about them before you could give them any constructive criticism. Your specific example where your daughter is working for some weekend time has 2 concerning aspects. One, telling her to get her work done might be pushing her a little too far, a little too fast. You need to establish a baseline, find out what she can do, and then you need to chart it. What we measure grows because we pay attention to it. And if she can do 1/3 of her homework by herself at one seating or through self-guided breaks, put that on a chart, put it on the kitchen refrigerator, and watch for it to grow. Encourage her to grow and have incentives as it grows until eventually that chart doesn't become important anymore. But as parents, we're going to use this reinforcement, but we can use the skills of the BCBA. We can measure, we can watch with detail, and we can actually do it in more of a systematic function.
I like that you encourage the positive instead of the negative. And I think it's really the negative, the aversions, the aversive techniques that many of us have had negative past experiences with, and why ABA, especially Lovaas himself, this idea that we can change people. And Also, because of my generation, Lovaas to me is also associated with conversion therapy, which makes him problematic on so many levels. And so I want a school system that doesn't rely on what I consider to be discredited portions of behaviorism. I want them to be supportive and encouraging, but not so much that my child doesn't take risks. And it's a difficult journey for every parent. I really am glad, though, that there are people like yourself out there as third parties. We did do a third party evaluation for our child. We'll probably do a third party one for our youngest as well. And I think part of that was having fresh eyes and giving us fresh insights also allowed us to go back to the school and mention things that maybe the school, being too familiar with the kids, hadn't really noticed or seen because they see the kids day after day.
Right.
And that third party also lets us go in and say, here are some of the positive things we can try instead of the wiggle table, which has a negative connotation. It sounds like punishment. I just don't like penalizing or shaming a child.
A lot of times, special education teams forget that we're here to address education, not just academics. And academics is a part of education, but so are social skills and self-esteem. And something like a wiggle table, you can imagine how that cannot be positive for a child's self-esteem unless the child realizes, I need to wiggle. I'm going back here, I'm going to do it, and then I'm going back to my desk. And I can do that anytime I need to. That creates that sort of self-determination that creates the self-esteem that we want to see in our children. And that would also lead to that risk tolerance that you're talking about, that ability of the child to take a risk and try something new. A lot of that is just also, in school, a kid passes or they fail. And if you take a test and you work really hard at it and you fail, you failed. But if you take a test and it's easy, and you get an A on it, fine, you passed it. But where's the effort rewarded? If we could start rewarding effort, we could see kids willing to try something hard and fail at it because the effort is what really matters. As adults, we come to learn that. As kids, we do everything in school to keep them from learning that.
I find that fascinating because I've taught, thankfully, at some very tolerant university departments. And one of my approaches with projects is that you can resubmit. As long as it's a class of reasonable size and you're willing to follow certain guidelines, you can resubmit. And colleagues have asked me about this. What am I doing? Encouraging students to redo the work. And my argument is that I would rather we graduate students that have that diploma and everyone who hires them knows that that person has the skill. Whether they got an A or a B, that person did that exercise, gained that knowledge through repetition if necessary. I tell my students, if everyone gets an A or a B, I will defend my grading to the dean, to the provost, to whomever, because I can show a portfolio of work where you turned in paper A and it got a C. And you came back a week later and you turned it in again with revisions and it got a B. And for whatever reason, you decided to make a final push and put it in your final portfolio for me and get an A. If I can show 3 papers that you did to get to that A and I can document that you did that work, then I don't see why you can't get the A the same as that student who, for whatever magical reason, is able to write a draft, write a paper, get an A. That student gets an A, I understand. But the student who does 3 times the work but still meets the final deadline, I'm more than happy to give that student the A.
Well, that student has practiced. They have looked at the information again and again. They have incorporated it. And my gosh, they feel good about finally getting over that challenge, that obstacle they thought they couldn't do. And so that student will go on to be a braver student in the future. And they've learned a skill. They've learned, if nothing else, I can tell my employer, you know what? I learned that this approach didn't work. I'm going to try a different approach next time.
IEP Incorporated is a private practice. How can listeners locate you on the web, find out information? And I will also include links to your publications on Amazon in the show notes. But how can they learn more about what you do and your philosophy?
Let me back up to one more idea about how parents can work with an IEP team to really get the services they need. And that is, I want parents to adapt that saying, not show me the money, but show me the data. Show me the data. If you think my child needs 2 extra days to complete assignments, show me the data that supports that. And if schools would have to do that, they would have to consider the individual child and the performance of that child. IEP Incorporated was something I stood up a number of years ago, and all the information is really found on my personal website, which is just drjuryturner.com, and that's Dr. drjuryturner.com. My contact information is there. I think both my phone and email address. We primarily work in California and Texas right now. We can do independent assessments in either state, throughout the entire state. When a parent requests an independent evaluation, they have to do it in writing, following a district assessment. And they simply have to be willing to say, we disagree with the assessment. They don't have to say why or how they disagree, just that they disagree. And I do not want anybody, in fact, if people come to me and I feel like they're abusing this privilege, then there's no way we're going to put the effort into helping. But I don't usually get that. Most of the time, all the time except for once, these parents they know something. They know their child's not learning. They know the school is trying their best, and they know what's being implemented is not correct, but they don't know why. And it's just a matter of spending a month or so with the team, with the child, in the school setting, in the virtual school setting, wherever it might be, and find out how this kid is learning. Once we find out how they can learn, then we can find out how they need to be taught.
I really like that, finding the way that the child best succeeds.
Yeah. Well, you've got to build on successes. This whole thing about learning from my failures, that's good and all. But if you really want to be successful, you learn from your successes. Why did I do this so well? Where did this strength, this inspiration come from? How can I take that passion, that inspiration, that knowledge, and apply it to other parts of my life? If I can learn from my successes, I'll grow much faster.
I hope that as an instructor, I have tried to do that with my students, and as a parent, but I think that all of us know that we fall short occasionally. And I think that should give us some pause and respect for when the teachers and the administration fall a little short. We need to remind ourselves we are all doing our best. I think it helps to go in with a positive attitude. Say, you know what? Sometimes as a parent, I don't hit the mark right. Sometimes as a teacher, I personally don't hit it right. So when I go into that IEP meeting, which in Texas, I think the first one's called an ARD, but when you go into that first meeting, avoid being negative right from the start. Go in saying, I understand we're all here for the same goal, which is to help my student succeed.
Absolutely. And at no point did I mean to, bash any psychologists or special ed teachers. I mean, I have the utmost respect. They're doing the best they can with the tools they have. And I'm just blessed that I don't have to take on 100 cases a year anymore. I can take on just a few, go down deep dive into each one of them. And it's a blessing that they don't have the opportunity to do. The law requires that the school consider our input. They don't have to live by it. And that's an important thing for the parents to know. Just because you get an independent assessor that says something, the school still doesn't have to obey that, but they do have to put up a good reason why they might not. I know that as a school psychologist, when an outside assessor came in and presented independent findings, I always just learned a lot. In fact, I stole a lot of their report writing techniques, and until over the years, until I could develop my own based on everything they taught me.
I think that is such a key to everything in life, is going in with the what can I learn from this?
Absolutely.
I ask myself, what can I learn from my daughters? My issues are different than my 9-year-olds. And my wife and I were talking. I am now in my 50s. I've had a lifetime of social training, a lot of it just negative experiences that taught me what not to do. Social cues I miss, working with my voice a lot. One reason I got interested in media production is that I struggled with public speaking and with communicating clearly. And it's still a struggle at times, and it's a conscious struggle. But I know many autistics who are actors, who do voice work, who do stage work. What I have learned to do is one set of social skills. My 9-year-old has different struggles than I had. Her struggles are going to be unique to her experiences as an autistic. Their experiences with ADHD will be different than anyone else's with ADHD or with any other disability. And that's what you're talking about when you say individualized. We can't just say, okay, here is autism, and here is the menu of things we do to accommodate the autistic.
One of the worst things I think a teacher can say in an IEP meeting, or an administrator or a school psychologist, is, I had a kid just like yours last year, and I did X, Y, and Z, and he is great now. Because there's no student just like yours. And don't even accept that as a phrase. And as director of special education, I removed that from my teachers' repertoire of phrases they could use. You also mentioned how you learn how to speak in public. You developed skills. Your public speaking difficulty was in part due to a skill deficit and a self-confidence deficit. But you emphasized the fact that now you have these coping skills, this mechanism, you learned it. And a lot of times we need to remember that what we see as a disability may just be a skill deficit. And our job is just to teach those skills.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to discuss that with our audience on the Autistic Me. I appreciate the fact that you're out there and advocating for students and families, as well as pointing out that the teachers and the administrators need help too. Everyone's in this together.
Absolutely. And where I might reach 1 or 2 students at a time, I appreciate the fact that you're doing something like this to reach hundreds, thousands, even more parents and educators. And you're having a huge impact. It reminds me of the Dalai Lama once said, if you think you're too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a flea. And, although I'm not saying you're a flea, and you get the point, we can make a difference. And I appreciate this. This is great.
Thank you so much. It's a journey. And when I talk to the autistic self-advocates, I think that we also need to remind ourselves, a lot of the autistic self-advocates use the slogan, when you meet an autistic, you've met one autistic person. And that's true. But then we slip into, well, this is my autism and this is what I experienced, and this must be what other autistics are experiencing, especially the nonverbal or the ones with greater support needs. I look at my needs versus my daughter's needs, and I have to realize and always tell myself, her autism isn't my autistic experience. It's not.
I don't mean this in a bad way, but the worst person in the world to diagnose dyslexia is somebody with dyslexia, because it's hard for them not to see dyslexia from their own point of view and experience. And that's just human nature. We have to realize that's where that person's going to come from, but they will bring the experience of having been dyslexic and demonstrate a level of success that you may want your student to see. And that happens with autistic professors and autistic evaluators and teachers.
To me, there is a real challenge when parents come up and say, when someone like myself or Temple Grandin, Lars Perner, Stephen Shore, when we speak in public, parents will come up to us and say, oh, you're such a great role model. I hope my child is like you. And my response is always, no, your child should be whatever your child wants to be and is capable of being.
Right. We remember Maslow and his hierarchy of needs as we strive to be who we are. That's who we need to find.
Thank you so much, Dr. Turner. It has been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the Autistic Me podcast. I, again, encourage listeners to check out the information available in the podcast notes, drjerryturner.com, and the links to his books on amazon.com as well. Thank you, Dr. Turner.
Thank you very much. This was great.